it worth more than food? Worth more than justice?
All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. You saw the intro, you heard the intro. That was Phoebe Plummer, a climate activist, throwing tomato soup on an expensive Van Gogh painting. Phoebe Plummer, from the looks of it, is Gen Z. She looks pretty young. And those are the most radical climate activists, the young ones. You know, me, where I stand, I'm not saying climate change isn't a thing at all, but I definitely do not think it's as big of a problem as, you know, some of these politicians make it out to be, some of the media make it out to be, and these climate activists like her who lay in the street and, you know, vandalize art. I don't think it's as big as they make it out to be. So we're about to get into this. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe while we're watching. Now let's roll it.
Well, unfortunately, that's not what's happening because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and you need to have fossil fuel backup to make up the gap. About half our energy every day is still coming from natural gas. Where's that going to come from?
Well, why aren't we implementing renewable technology? The largest solar farm in the UK was built in 6 weeks.
But it's not
it takes up to 28 years for any oil to come out of the ground in the North Sea.
But it's not going to produce any energy at night. That's the problem with renewables, is that they don't provide the base load that you need.
We already have the capacity to provide so much of our energy from renewables without any technology needed for storage solutions.
But where is this coming from? Because when the wind doesn't blow, when we had really cold days, we were reliant on importing from the EU, on coal and on gas. How are we going to replace that in the short term?
Quite frankly, I'm not a scientist. What I am doing is listening to what all the experts are saying. We're living in this insane world where the experts aren't being listened to. The United Nations has called for no more oil and gas. The International Energy Agency has said we can have no new oil and gas. The IPCC report, the largest global report on the climate crisis, have all said we can have no new oil and gas. How many more experts need to say it?
All right, guys, so I want to address something really quickly. Before I started watching this morning when I got up, I was watching this Bjorn Lomborg podcast. He was on PBD, and something that he said, you know, he's a climate scientist, a climate economist, and something that he said to the contrary of what Phoebe Plummer just said is that while, yes, many scientists and many economists, climate scientists and economists can agree that climate change is a thing, we only hear the perspective of climate scientists and not so much the perspective of climate economists. Most climate economists will say while climate change is a thing, it's out there, the framing of climate change, which creates this illusion of a dire situation that will kill us all in the next 10 years or 20 years, is not quite so accurate. And I say that to tell you guys that these articles, these politicians who are painting climate change as the end of the world, you know, within the next 20 years or whatever it is they say, they don't go and speak to everyone who they should be speaking to get a well-rounded opinion. They get what they need to push their fear narrative, and then they keep it moving. And that's why you have, you know, young teenagers and young adults, you know, like this, vandalizing paintings and in outrage over the climate.
We can have no new oil and gas. How many more experts need to say it?
Because we can't do it tomorrow. What are we going to do in terms of transport? That we still need petrol for cars and we need diesel for lorries. How are we going to get goods into supermarkets without this?
Quite frankly, I'm not a scientist. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the world, and we're living the effects of the climate crisis today. Right now, people are dying. Children are starving. Families are fleeing their homes.
But
you see what I mean? Like the language. Listen to the language that she's using. It's so heavy. People are dying. People are fleeing their homes. I mean, if you take this girl's word for it, you would think that you got to do something right now. But is it really as bad as she's saying?
Energy.
And it's preventable. We have the solutions.
Cheap energy is one of the things that has hugely extended life expectancy by the ability to control temperatures, whether this is by air conditioning or by heating, the ability to store food more effectively, the ability to transport food, and indeed use fertilizers to grow more food, has all been essential in increasing life expectancy. Taking all that away would be disastrous for life expectancy.
Do you know what's essential in keeping our food supply? Tackling the climate crisis. This year we lost a third of our wheat crops, half of our potato crops. and it's only going to get worse. We're heading to a future where people are going to be fighting over the last loaves of bread at Lidl.
But the only way we get our wheat crop is by putting the fertilisers on that come from fossil fuels. How are we going to replace that? That the productivity of organic farming is so much lower than of modern farming methods. We cannot feed the world on organic farming, and you must know that.
How do you expect to feed the world when our crops are destroyed by droughts, floods, wildfires, storms?
You've always had weather events that have affected crops, but that actually using fossil fuels for fertilisers and moving on to genetic modification of crops has enormously increased the yield. That since Malthus rate, we've increased agricultural productivity by about 2% per annum. And this is what is allowing people to get extended life expectancy because they've got more certainty of food. And this all depends on cheap energy, which has come from fossil fuels.
Jacob, you have 6 children? Do you not care about their future? Do you not care about them being able to feed themselves? Because right now, under this government's policies, your 6 children are heading towards a future that is filled with life-threatening extreme weather events, crop failures, famine, war. Suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
I think you've taken the evidence for an evolving climate and then applied it in an extraordinarily extreme way and are forgetting about the enormous advantages.
I can't believe you're talking to me about an evolving climate.
Well, the climate is...
People are dying.
But this is
Do you
a
know
statement...
how many people are suffering around the world?
What evidence is there that this is because we're using fossil fuels, that the climate evolves, but more people die each year from cold than from heat?
Yeah, honestly, like where is the evidence that what we're doing, the human intervention, is the direct cause of all of this dying and famine and starving and all of the things that she's mentioning here? And just from a debate standpoint, he's giving more examples. He's being a lot more rational in his arguments, and she is just making this, call to fear. She's fear-mongering everybody. And the next, your kid's future is going to be terrible. There'll be floods, there'll be famine. Like, she's just stoking fear, really. And might I add, these solar panels and wind turbines, they use energy to produce, and then they also create a waste problem. And like he said in the beginning, when it comes to energy, fossil fuels is the most efficient energy that we have, and you're not gonna replace fossil fuels with wind turbines and solar panels overnight. It's not as potent of an energy source.
Have you read the IPCC report? What do you mean? What science?
But in terms, you're making extreme claims, but you're suggesting by not using fossil fuels, we would not produce the food we need to feed the world population.
I'm suggesting that if we keep on heading down this genocidal path of mass destruction, then no, there won't be any foods in the supermarket. Then we will see vast swathes of the world uninhabitable. We will see mass displacement of people.
But if you took out fossil fuels tomorrow, you would simply not have the productivity of agriculture you need to feed 8 or 9 billion people. And that would be tomorrow. And I'm not...
And what she's saying isn't exactly true, because you can build upon the infrastructure to combat the changing climate and rising sea levels and things like that. That's what Florida has done. They raised the roads over there in Florida, and it's other type of technological interventions that you can introduce that can combat climate change. Much more rational discussions rather than we'll all be dead in a few years. And again, I'm just citing the Bjorn Lomborg PBD podcast. Bjorn Lomborg mentioned that the introduction of the catalytic converter was a big technological advancement that helped clear a lot of the smog out of California, because the catalytic converter is like a little cleaner for your car. It makes the car's emissions cleaner than they were before. So that's just an example of technology helping to ease some of the climate stress.
I'm not saying you shouldn't reduce emissions. I'm not arguing that. I'm simply saying you must do it when you have the technology to replace the energy that you're using. Because otherwise, all the consequences you're arguing for will happen immediately. We will simply not have the food we need to feed the population of the world.
Jacob, we're not asking for the taps to be turned off tomorrow. All of you know that. We're asking for an end to all new fossil fuel licenses, in line with what climate scientists around the world are saying.
But if you turn it off for new licenses now, you're requiring a change that is going to happen before we have the technology in place to substitute for it. So you may be delaying it by a few years, but this has to be a rational process to do it once you've got the technology sorted out, and we haven't got the technology yet.
So I understand you're an economics man. Yes. So
no, I'm interested in economics.
Yeah. So I've done some maths for you. I hope you don't mind. I looked up your net worth online. It's quite easy to find.
I've done some maths.
It's not actually true. It's easy to find, but it's not actually true.
In the hundreds of millions.
But that's not.
It costs around £20,000 to insulate a British home. So that's 8,000 British homes for your 150 net million, which is what it says online.
Which is untrue. But
do you really think that you're worth more than 8,000 cold, freezing families?
Have you seen the studies on insulation? That insulation.
Do you care about the people living in fuel poverty?
So now she's using his wealth against him?
Very much so. When I was Secretary of State for Energy, I was responsible for developing the plan that has brought energy prices down for families. That was policy that I was intimately involved in designing, so of course I care about that.
So you do understand the report that you're asking me about says that the cost of insulating British homes is so expensive because of the government's failure to insulate British homes.
But what happens 3 years after people have insulated their homes? They use the same amount of energy as they did before. There's been a study on this, which I'm sure you've seen reports on. In the first year they save money, in the second year they save a small amount of money, in the third year they have actually made themselves warmer because the economics of it is they have a certain amount they can spend on energy.
What happens when the government fails to insulate British homes? 7.5 million British people live in fuel poverty. Parents are starving themselves so that they can feed their children, and people are freezing to death in their homes because they are forced to choose between heating and eating. People are dying. Are you hearing me?
Because it's simply not true. The government introduced a cap on energy prices and support for families who couldn't afford energy prices, that those were brought in last year, and they are very significant supports to ensure...
What do you mean it's not true? Have you spoken to an ordinary person who is suffering the cost of living crisis right now?
I don't believe there's any such thing as ordinary people. I believe everybody is in their individual way quite remarkable. I think ordinary people is the most condescending way of referring to our fellow British citizens.
Well, of course you don't relate to the ordinary people. You're a millionaire.
The figures, my personal circumstances are nothing
She's so nasty. Like, the attitude.
To do with whether we impoverish people by making energy prices higher. And you want to make them higher, and I don't. But what I'd say to you finally is, why don't you stand for election? Why do you think it is right to throw soup over a picture rather than standing election and seeing if you can get people to vote for your view of the world?
You're an educated man, Jacob. You know that this is how successful movements of social change happen. They must cause disruption. And Antonio Guterres, he's the Secretary General of the United Nations. He has said that we are on a highway to climate hell. He has said that licensing new fossil fuels is economic and moral madness. The Secretary General of the United Nations is calling for an end to all new fossil fuels. What makes you think that I have time to get into power and make these changes?
So you want to be a dictator? You don't want voters to decide.
That's absolutely not what I said, and you know that.
Why don't you stand for election? Put yourself forward and see if people want your way.
Because we don't have time. Because if I want to have a future, if I want to have a future where I can feed myself, where I can love my family,
we're not going to feed them. We're not going to feed them without fossil fuels, which are the essential fertilizers.
We need to make the change now.
I'm going to have to move on, but I hope you'll come back because
I like the answer that he gave. He said that if you just take away fossil fuels, then, you know, everyone will be in pain. Everyone will be struggling very fast, very soon. And she's saying that we don't have time. So those two things go hand in hand. If you're saying that, if she's saying that we don't have time, she wants to roll back fossil fuels in mass quickly to combat climate. But he's saying if you do that, then that will have some very dire consequences that Phoebe Plummer isn't exactly thinking about.
I've enjoyed this discussion, and I think it's really good of you to have come on. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you to Phoebe.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to play the outro, but closing statements on this whole climate issue. Look, I'm no climate expert. I remember in 6th grade, I saw the Al Gore movie about climate change. Somebody in the comments remind me what was it about. But I've heard the world was going to end in my short 26, 27 years of life. I've heard the world was going to end probably like four different times. 4 different times, all because of some climate catastrophe. I think that, like many issues in politics, politicians, the media, They get these narratives, they find whatever study it is that they need to find to, paint a narrative that this is a dire situation that needs action now, that you need to vote for me for, and I'll help to fix this. And they just fearmonger people, and they make this drastic, dire situation out of something that we could be having much more reasonable conversations about. I don't think it's a bad thing to introduce new forms of energy. I think it's cool. I always thought it was cool. When I seen an electric car, when I saw solar panels and all that, I'm like, yo, this is cool. You know what I'm saying? But to think that will power the world. I mean, look what happened in Texas when the grids went down and it was cold out in Texas. Like, to think that solar panels and wind turbines and things like that are going to power the world over fossil fuels, especially in a very fast manner, is absurd to me. But that's it for the video, you guys. Let me know what you thought about this in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And until next time, I'm out of here. Peace.